Good morning. The lesson for today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." I've had almost 2 months to live with this text since I agreed to do this day. And I've had an awful lot of thoughts come to mind. And you might not be able to see it, but I can see it in our service today in the hymns that I picked out a few weeks ago, because I still wasn't quite settled yet on what I was going to talk about. And I went through a big editing process so that you wouldn't get 6 sermons all in one today. So when this text comes up again, I'll give you one of the other 5 I've thought of. But I have to tell you that the very first thought I had when I read this text was a memory from when I was 10 years old. It was the summer of 1959, and doing the math, I'm 67. My dad and I had gone to the movies, and it was kind of fun for me to go out on a date with my dad. We had gone to see the movie Ben-Hur, starring Charlton Heston. And believe it or not, that movie was the first thing that popped into my head when I read this text. Now, I only remember 2 things about this movie because I was 10 and it was 57 years ago. But I remember a very big chariot race, which I've gotten on YouTube to see again. And yep, it was a big chariot race. And those horses were really well behaved, I have to say. But the thing that I remember the most about that movie, the thing that evoked this memory for me, was leaving the theater that night with an overwhelming sense of dread that I was going to get leprosy. Now, I'm 10 years old. Those lepers lived in a cave. They had to be, kindly women had to bring food to them and leave it at the entrance of the cave. They couldn't be with their families anymore. I was convinced that one morning I was going to wake up and be kind of like a disassembled Mr. Potato Head. There were going to be body parts kind of laying in bed, because that's what happens when you get leprosy. Body parts fall off. And remember, I'm 10. It was a very anxious time for me. From my perspective as a young child, growing up in a very conservative fundamentalist church that believed in a literal interpretation of the Bible, that's all that I knew about leprosy was what I had already learned in church. That the God I knew was very angry and vengeful, that God could smite you with all kinds of things, including leprosy, and sin was somehow connected to all of this. And having been taught that we are all born in original sin, there's no getting out of this sin business, leprosy seemed like a logical connection to me because I was sinful. God could give you leprosy. And so there I was. There I was. My fingers were going to fall off. That's it. So it wasn't a very pleasant movie for me to watch with that in mind. Well, leprosy is not a topic that comes up at the dinner table. I'm not sure that anybody here outside of people in the healthcare profession know a lot about leprosy. And in fact, we were with our friend yesterday who's a doctor, And I said, Rick, what do you know about leprosy? And he said, well, there's an antibiotic, and I can't remember the name. And the conversation stopped. So Jordy and Karen and others, you might know a little bit more. I knew nothing except what I have already told you. I went on the internet, the source of all truth, and learned some things about leprosy which you might find interesting. I found it interesting because it really helped calm my anxious child inside of me. That leprosy is caused by a bacteria. It is contagious, but not influenza pandemic contagious. It is transmitted through water droplets, so you've got to be in direct line with a cough or a sneeze from an infected person and have frequent contact in order to be infected with this bacteria. And as my friend knew yesterday, it is treatable. There's a multi-drug therapy that was put together in the 40s and revised again in the 60s and the 90s to help effectively treat leprosy. It is all but eradicated in first world countries. There are still leper colonies, and I don't know if any lepers live in caves or not, and I kind of think those leper colonies might be like nursing homes where people with leprosy would reside. One interesting fact is that once infected, it's a very slow-growing bacteria. So it takes anywhere between 5 and 20 years to manifest itself in the terms of any symptoms. The name leprosy comes from the Latin root word of lepra, which means scaly. And indeed, one of the outward symptoms of leprosy is a very scaly, off-putting skin. I saw pictures of people with leprosy, and they looked like they had barnacles on them. It was not a pretty sight, very off-putting. It lives in the upper respiratory tract. And so there's the rub. To me, I got the image of bronchitis, not being able to breathe very effectively, and the coughing part, and that's how the transmission then would occur. It is also a disease which affects certain nerves, primarily the optic nerve, which affects one's vision, and the peripheral nerves, which affect those arms and legs and fingers and toes and hands and feet, the parts that are going to fall off. They don't fall off spontaneously. I have learned that one may suffer the loss of an appendage because of injury, you can't feel it, or infection. Again, you can't feel it. You've lost your sense of feeling. And over this past week, I've been very conscious of that particular one as I burned myself taking something out of the oven, as I did curl my hair this morning. This is it. And I touched a hot part of the curling iron. If I had lost my sense of feeling, I would have sustained injury to my hands and arms. Well, imagine me sitting in my chair in our family room with my laptop on my lap and reading all about leprosy, something that, everyday occurrence here. And the television was on at the time. And because this is a fairly interesting election cycle, to say the least, no doubt I had CNN on as I watched or listened to the news while I'm reading about leprosy, and all of a sudden, I had a light bulb go off in my head. As I have read the symptoms of this leprosy that affect the skin, the lungs, the eyes, and a sense of feeling, and I looked up at the television to probably some political panel that was duking it out, it occurred to me that perhaps today we suffer from a modern form of leprosy. And I've called it Leprosy 2.0. For anybody who has computers, you get the reference. If you don't, a numeric reference after a title indicates the next version of. So the next version of program ABC would be 2.0. The one after that is 3.0. The one after that is 4.0. I have a feeling that Windows 7.0 wasn't a good idea, but anyway. Well, what made me think of this is those people who were debating, and that's a loose term, around that table. It appeared to me in my mental image, this metaphor, that their skin was impenetrable. They had body armor on. Whatever arrows were being slung in their direction were being reflected off. It also appeared to me that they were not stopping to take a breath. You know, when a child is tantruming, you try to calm them down and say, whoa, 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 just take a deep breath. It seemed to me they didn't even have the capacity to do that. The only thing that these people on this panel were seeing was their tunnel vision of their own perspective. And it appeared to me that they did not have a sense of feeling, of compassion, of sympathy, of empathy. And the juxtaposition of me reading these medical symptoms along with what I'm watching on TV made me decide that I wasn't going to talk about giving thanks today, even though tomorrow is Thanksgiving Day in Canada. I was going to modern day leprosy here, leprosy 2.0. So if you buy that theory with me, how did we get to this place? How did we get to a place where we are in such disagreement and rancor with one another? And I know in a political world, and I am going to talk a little bit about politics, but not about parties, so don't worry, I'm not even going to go there. But it seems to me that our experience over time, our personal experiences, help create that body armor, that impenetrable skin. It helps create perhaps an intolerance, impatience, the inability to take a breath and calm down. It helps create perhaps our own personal tunnel vision. Imagine being in a cave like those lepers in ancient days. And what do you see around you? You see that, because the rest is dark. And perhaps our sense of feeling for one another is diminished by these life experiences, which can take place over the course of a generation. Many of you know that I was born in Detroit, but I was 2 years old when my parents moved to a lily white affluent suburb just over the edge of the city. And for 16 years, until I graduated from high school, I lived in this community. There were no others. There were no African Americans, there were no Muslims, there were no Asians, there were no others. Diversity came in the form of whether your dad worked at Ford or GM, because that was it. One of my good childhood friends growing up on our block, her dad owned a grocery store. All I heard was grocery store, and I felt sorry for this family because her dad wasn't an engineer or an attorney like everybody else. He owned a grocery store. Of course, it wasn't Fred Meyer, but it was his own business. So experiences that I had during that incubation period were being held up at gunpoint, having a sawed-off shotgun stuck in my belly. Experiences during that incubation period were riots in Detroit. When I went off to college in the late 60s, it was my first experience with others. My roommate's name was Fatima, and she was from Persia. I still can't remember if that's Iraq or Iran. My suite mate was an African American. And to show you how infected I was, she was putting up a picture in her dorm room of a middle-aged black man, and I said, "Wendy, is that your dad?" And there was a very long pause, and she turned to me and said, "That's Martin Luther King." And I had no face recognition of that. Sometimes we isolate ourselves from others, and that further fosters this inward thinking that we have. It's very easy to live in our own cave with our own friends who think the same way that we do, who practice the same practices that we do. Another source of infection, in my opinion, has to be those cable news shows. I decided about a month ago, and I'm a kind of a fan of CNN, and mainly because I tend to agree with a lot that they say. But I decided I needed to stretch my wings a little bit and watch a few other ones just to see what was going on. So I turned on MSNBC, well, there's no difference there, and I turned on Fox. And it was very interesting to me that when the latest breaking news was coming out, two of them were reporting story A, and a third was reporting story B. And a steady diet of either, of one or the other, is not perhaps in our best interest when we look at the world, hopefully with an impassioned, impartial heart. Suffering is suffering, joy is joy, and not through the lens of a particular editor or reporter. Well, if you continue to buy this theory with me that there might be a metaphoric leprosy today, there is a cure, and we find it in the last verse of the passage that I read. Jesus says, "Get up and go on your way." So I'm going to suggest that means get out of your metaphoric cave. It means turn off the TV. It means engage in a real conversation with someone, not just a shouting match, or waiting for the pause so that you can jump in and continue to defend a position. Listening with real ears and real heart to what other people are saying, because maybe it's not the words that they're saying. Maybe there's an underlying message. Maybe you're hearing their experiences come out in a whole different way. Perhaps broadening exposure to other thoughts and ideas is a good idea as well. You know, when I thought of that one, I thought about being a teacher. And the sickest years of my life were in those first few years of teaching, because every kid sneezed on me, wiped their nose on me. Not everyone barfed on me, but that's the world of a young teacher. And I can imagine that's the world of a young healthcare provider too. We are in a hotbed of germs. But the older I got, the more my immunity built up to that. I think I could fall in a pit of malaria and come out good because of all of the germs that I had been exposed to in my younger life. So this whole thing got me thinking about listening and talking, being in a real discussion, being open to new ideas, being open to new perspectives, and open to new thoughts. And it occurred to me that not long ago, within this calendar year, in fact, we voted to become an open and affirming congregation. The knee-jerk for me in hearing those words is we are open to accepting people who may have a different sexual preference than the majority of us, that we are open to accommodating people who are differently abled than us. And I think we can agree that those are two big parts of the piece of open and affirming. But I'd like to challenge us to think about being open and affirming to different points of view. Is there room at our table for people who might not think of things in a particular way that the collective group here does? And I would hope that the answer is yes. Now, there are certain basic truths and values that our faith community has accepted. And if people cannot abide or even understand those, don't want to be associated with that, that's okay. There are multiple references in the New Testament about picking up your sandals, dusting off your feet, and going to the next town. But I would hope that we would be able to engage in a healthy conversation with people. Faith is a journey, and it is one that the United Church of Christ understands. In fact, that's one of their little catchphrases about being on a journey, and I would hope that we could journey together. I get a mental image of a wagon train. Not every wagon is at the front of that wagon train, and not every wagon is at the back of the wagon train. But we are all on this journey together. We have different perspectives along this way. I know that I'm different now. I'm different than an anxious 10-year-old who thought that leprosy was, that's it, folks. I'm doomed. I am different than I was in my 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. I'm different than I was last year. I have in many ways evolved, and I don't know if I'm going around in a circle or a serpentine or a straight line or I've fallen in the ditch, but I know that I am different and moving on than from where I was before. Shannon brought at one point a beautiful sentiment to probably the church council at the time, or maybe it was just at one of our conferences, but I remember it very distinctly. There are some churches that feel they have all the answers. That's the church I grew up in. Sin, hell, damnation, and I would put another comma there, leprosy. Would we rather not be the church that has all the questions, where it is a safe place to have a dialogue, a safe place to ask those questions, a safe place to doubt? And I hope that that would be true for us, that there is room at the table. I listened very closely to Paul Benjamin 3 weeks ago when he was up here accounting for his path on this journey. And I would hope that we could accommodate that person, myself included, who sways back and forth. Is it this? I don't know. What's my life experience asking of me? Is it over here? Maybe. So as we have those doubt questions and those wonderful conversations that are wrapped around it, that is healthy for us. That is very healthy for us. And as Jesus asks us to do and tells us to do, we need to live our life in faith as we understand it. So in time, as Jesus closes this passage, he says, "Your faith has made you well." And by faith, we pray that our body armor will fall away, that our lungs will be clear to take that calming breath so that we can engage in healthy and productive conversations, that our vision will be restored beyond our own selves, beyond this cave, and that our sense of feeling will be renewed. We demonstrate that here every Thursday afternoon and evening with our open table. And if you haven't participated yet, please consider doing so. Well, of the 10 lepers that were cured, I'm going to say one was restored. One was restored to turn around and give thanks. Way back long ago, and for having been raised a very conservative Lutheran, October is a high holy month because this is, at the end of the month, the anniversary of the Reformation, the event that started the whole Protestant movement. And I read something interesting about that. The first letters of Protestant are protest. So, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, but Martin Luther on this is 500 years ago this happened, by the way. Martin Luther was asked what the truest form of worship was. And he replied, "It's the 10th leper turning around." So as we gather today, we have turned around from our lives to gather here, to worship God, to praise God, and to give thanks to God for all that we have in our lives.